Hi, everyone. Welcome. You're here for the War in Space, Weaponization and Deterrence session. I'm just going to give it another couple minutes to allow some attendees to trickle in. All right, I'm seeing the pace of people coming in slow down, so we can start. Welcome, everyone. Again, if you missed it, this is War in Space, Weaponization and Deterrence. We're going to have two speakers from Rice University who are both in the Masters of Global Affairs program today. We have Lauren Buchanan and Angel Smith. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A function in Zoom. That should be at the bottom of your screen. And we will go through questions after they've both had a chance to speak. And first up will be Lauren.
Hi, everybody. Let me get my screen up. All right, so this is the War in Space, Weaponization and Deterrence panel. Me and Angel are going to be speaking. Here's a little overview of today's agenda for the next hour and a half or so. And so today I'm going to be speaking about the weaponization of space and analyzing some past international attempts at creating legally binding anti-weaponization measures. And from there, we'll look at some key points that can be taken from those experiences and what those can tell us about space weaponization and what future international cooperation efforts on this front might be facing. The militarization of space has been an ongoing process since the beginning of space exploration, and that is not likely to ever change. The development and use of space weapons is a separate but connected issue to militarization. Beginning during the Cold War, the US and USSR utilized counter-space weapons to defend their satellite infrastructure, and space has steadily been weaponized since then, but has not yet become a domain of war. There have been multiple efforts throughout the decades to come to bilateral and international agreements to limit the use of weapons in space. However, none of those attempts have been particularly successful in halting the proliferation of space weapons. The most basic definition of space weaponization is the inclusion of the domain of space as either the launching location or target location of an effort to inflict damage. For the purposes of this discussion, we'll be speaking about counter-space weapons, Earth to space and space to space, as they are most relevant to current technological capabilities. And additionally, Earth-to-Earth weapons may be considered if they're targeting the ground equipment of the space system. There are four general categories that these types of weapons can fit into. Kinetic weapons enact damage through direct strikes. These are weapons in the most traditional sense, also called mass to target. They include direct descent and co-orbital anti-satellite weapons, also known as ASATs, as well as more conventional ballistic weapons that may be used to strike ground stations. Non-kinetic weapons enact damage without physical contact. They are called directed energy weapons as well. They include equipment that can target lasers, high-powered microwaves, and electromagnetic pulses at space systems. And nuclear weapons would also fit into this category. Electronic weapons interfere with space systems' radio frequency signals. Such weapons either block the transfer of data, called jamming, or they falsify the source of data, called spoofing. Cyber weapons target the computer programming of a space system. Code-based attacks weaponize that targeted system, and they can affect data by either monitoring it, corrupting it, or controlling it. Now I'm going to go over three key initiatives at legally binding limitations of space weapons. There are also important discussions to be had about non-binding agreements, such as transparency and confidence building measures. But for the purposes of this discussion, we will look at those that are legally binding. So 10 years after Sputnik 1, the United Nations passed the Outer Space Treaty of 1967. And this is still the most widely accepted agreement governing the military use of space. It states that space exploration shall be carried out freely and for the benefit of all mankind. And while the treaty provides restrictions for the military use of space, it does not ban the use of any weapons besides nuclear ones. And after the treaty was ratified, the US and USSR continued to develop non-nuclear space weaponry. Now, in 1972, the Treaty on the Limitation of Anti-Ballistic Missile Systems was signed, and this treaty specifically prohibited powers from developing, testing, or deploying ABM systems. Now, the focus of anti-weaponization then shifted to ASAP systems, as each power increased developing and testing of these technologies throughout the 70s. This brings us to 1983, when President Reagan announced the US's Strategic Defense Initiative. Now, the USSR feared that this would violate the provisions of the previous treaty by resuming the development of space-based ABMs. And in response, the Soviets undertook a concerted effort to internationally prohibit the development and use of space weapons. The US objected to all of the proposed measures, arguing that space weapons was too ambiguous of a category for banning, and that the USSR was only trying to do so in order to undermine various defense and space programs of the US. And the remainder of this decade saw a series of negotiations between the two powers, which focused primarily on determining what uses of what technologies should be included in a space weapons ban. The US contended that the SDI program didn't violate the ABM treaty because the program was limited to research and experimental operations and didn't include deployment. And it was important to these negotiators that the US retain freedom to develop these and other potential technologies for defensive purposes. Russian negotiators held that such equipment should only be studied in laboratory settings and never launched. These negotiations ended when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and no conclusion was ever reached. This brings us to the prevention of an arms race in outer space, which is the most relevant kind of discussion around anti-weaponization currently. Now, recognizing the limitations of the Outer Space Treaty, and the United Nations Conference on Disarmament in 1985 established an ad hoc committee to negotiate issues relevant to preventing an arms race in outer space, Paris. The CD convened annually for 9 years until it was blocked by the US because the US had not identified any practical outer space arms control measures that could be dealt with in a multilateral environment. And to this day, the US argues that such legal instruments would be ineffective in preventing the development of counterspace capabilities, and advocates instead for non-binding transparency and confidence building measures. And now, accordingly, the US has voted against every Paris resolution brought before the UN in the years since, typically being the only country alongside Israel to do so. And right now, the treaty that currently has the most international attention was submitted to the UN in 2008 by Russia and China, called the Treaty on the Prevention of the Placement of Weapons in Outer Space and the Threat or Use of Force Against Outer Space Objects, commonly referred to as the PPWT. Now, the primary purpose of this treaty is, number one, to prohibit weapons from being deployed to space, and number two, to prohibit force being threatened or used against objects in space. The US has argued against the adoptions of these measures. I included a quote here by US Ambassador Robert Wood as he addressed the UN to explain the United States vote against a 2017 resolution to establish a group of experts that would make recommendations for legally binding Paris instruments. Ambassador Wood cites the resolution's use of PPWT as a foundation for the group's review process. Specifically, he identifies three concerns: that it does not effectively ban Earth-to-space ASAT weapons, that it does not adequately define what a space weapon is, and that it does not establish an effective verification of compliance. Now, while the US's decision not to support PPWT is certainly motivated, at least in part, by an unwillingness to give up their own counter space capabilities, these critiques are also valid. Next, we're going to get into some common trends that we've seen across these case studies of international initiatives. Number one, we see that the term space weapons is too broad to use in negotiations due to the dual use nature of these instruments. Lack of consensus as to what constitutes a space weapon has been an impediment to anti-weaponization negotiations. And one of the primary obstacles to clearly identifying space weaponry is the fact that a diverse range of instruments, and not all of them strictly relating to space or even necessarily weapons, can enact damage to equipment in orbit or ground equipment. We've gone over the 4 categories of space weapons: kinetic, non-kinetic, electronic, and cyber. And each of these 4 categories comprise equipment that can be utilized to attack a space system. However, the latter 2 are not specific to space, so the equipment can't be reasonably banned by a space weapons treaty. And similarly, non-kinetic equipment such as lasers are often used both in civilian and military purposes, making it difficult to single them out in negotiations. We also have the fact that offensive and defensive counter space capabilities are often one and the same. Most nations claim to pursue the weaponization of space in order to improve their defensive capabilities. But the line between defensive and offensive weapons is often unclear or non-existent. Russia, China, the US, India all justify their development of counter space weapons as a defensive measure. But the issue with this reasoning is that offensive and defensive space weapons, as we said, are largely one and the same. For example, space-based missile interceptors, which may be deployed as a defensive measure against co-orbital ASAT weapons, inherently have offensive capabilities themselves. If an interceptor has the ability to damage or destroy an oncoming enemy missile, it also has the same ability to do so to an enemy satellite. This is true with almost all defensive space weapons. Traditional weapons are similarly difficult to distinguish. However, there's a consensus that defensive weapons are those of limited range and destructive capabilities. But in the case of space weapons, which are necessarily long range, this distinction becomes harder to make. And therefore, as nations are building their defensive capabilities, they're also necessarily contributing to this preponderance of offensive weapons. And finally, we have the fact that verification of compliance is very difficult to carry out with space systems. Verification has traditionally been a vital component of disarmament. However, this is very difficult to implement for most forms of space weapons after deployment. One of the most obvious reasons for this is that the equipment can only be practically inspected prior to launch and upon return. And verification of operations would require that equipment return to Earth periodically, or that equipment is sent into space to carry out the inspection there. Space situational awareness systems allow limited monitoring of objects in orbit. However, it's often difficult to discern nefarious behavior from abnormal maneuvers and rendezvous and proximity operations. Even Earth-to-space weapons would be difficult to verify, as most equipment in this category serves dual purposes, as we discussed. For example, the Russian Beriev A-60, few of which have been equipped with ASAT equipment by the Russian military, still primarily exist as airborne research laboratories. And verification of some Earth-to-space weapons would be manageable. National technical means such as infrared energy detecting satellites and space situational awareness systems may be utilized to collect data and verify compliance with obligations to a certain extent. Next, we're going to get into some considerations for stakeholders in this situation. We have the aspect of space debris. There's currently an estimated 21,000 large man-made objects in orbit. Only 1,800 of these are satellites, and the remaining 19,200 are pieces of debris. This space debris is made up of non-operational spacecraft remains from collisions, and remains from collisions, as well as non-operational spacecraft. The majority of debris used to come from the upper stages of launch vehicles, but currently more than a third of the space debris was created in 2 recent events: China's 2007 ASAT test and a 2009 accidental crash between Russian and US satellites. The use of kinetic weapons creates far more debris than any other form of space activity. The debris is dangerous to spacecrafts and satellites in orbit because even a small piece can cause critical damage upon collision. And if it accumulates faster than it naturally exits orbit, space operations could be seriously jeopardized. And we also have this idea of contested hegemony. So while the counterspace capabilities of Russia and China are not currently as developed as that of the US, they are on a trajectory to close that gap. While introducing the 2020 Defense Space Strategy, former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Space Policy, Stephen Katay, attested that the US is rapidly losing its advantage in space to Russia and China. And there is extensive evidence that both countries are investing heavily into their counterspace abilities. China is developing and testing weapons at an incredible rate, particularly considering that its first successful space weapons test was in 2007. And Russia benefits from decades of Soviet-era research and technology and is clearly seeking to reassert the country as a dominant force in this area. And then in the recent years, as Russia and China have developed these highly advanced counterspace weapons programs that can threaten US space infrastructure, both powers have demonstrated advanced capabilities in ballistic, directed energy, electronic, and cyber attacks. And in response, the United States has increased development of its own counterspace technology. And the line of thought here is that the more that these weapons proliferate, the more vulnerable all nations feel to a possible attack. And this cycle of insecurity could lead to an arms race in space. Now we're going to end with a couple outlooks that we've pulled from our discussion so far. Number one, the uninhibited weaponization endangers civilian and military use of space. Now the stakes of the situation are very high as the world has developed a near complete dependence on satellite space services. And the rise of the information age, which was facilitated by these systems' ability to collect, process, store, and distribute information, now they support most vital functions of society, both military and civilian, commercial. The threat of space equipment being targeted by enemy weapons is obvious. However, even a defensive weapons test can indirectly cause critical damage through the creation of space debris, which can collide with satellites or spacecrafts. Finally, we have the fact that legal and diplomatic attempts at anti-weaponization have been fundamentally flawed in ways that prevented their execution, as we saw through those case studies. From the beginning, international and bilateral negotiations have lacked clear terms and practical verification measures. There are significant differences between disarmament on land and disarmament in space, stemming from the very nature of space weapons. It's impossible to prohibit some instruments capable of damaging space equipment because they're not solely utilized for that purpose. And the similarity of defensive and offensive space weapons largely prevents a selective ban of the latter. And finally, if a comprehensive space weapons ban were to pass, it would be difficult to enforce compliance on co-orbital equipment because of the lack of practical verification methods for an object in space. Finally, the way that many people see it is that the US faces a decision between pursuing its space weapons program fully and possibly perpetuating an arms race in space, or agreeing to restrict weaponization and possibly losing a defensive advantage. Now, historically, the US has been the sole influential actor preventing progress toward legally binding instruments to reduce space weapons. The country has closely guarded its freedom to develop this counter-space capability. Disarmament in space has not really been a consideration that has been entertained by the country, as it has proven effective to be the dominant space power that other states cannot or will not move against. Now, this approach was successful for several decades, with the nation displaying clear superiority. However, as Russia and China have accelerated their space weapons programs, they now have the ability to legitimately counter US hegemony. And in light of this, as we said, many people see the US having two options: escalate the situation further by increasing development of its own weapons, or join the international community in cooperating to limit space weapons. So, thinking about this situation I presented, the way forward seems daunting. I've given you several reasons why space disarmament is extremely difficult and past efforts have not been successful. But I've also implied that international cooperation toward anti-weaponization may be the only way forward if we're going to prevent an arms race from jeopardizing future use of space. I don't think that this is an impossible task, but it will require dedication and creative problem solving by all powers. Um, Despite this history of militarization and weaponization that I've laid out, there is also a really strong legacy of international cooperation and innovation in space that I believe could be expanded upon and lead to an optimal outcome. And with that, I'll hand the floor over to my colleague, Angel Smith, to give an additional perspective on this topic.
Yeah, thank you so much, Lauren, for providing us with such detailed background. It really helps set the stage for our conversation around deterrence and why deterrence is an important component or should be an important component of the US's strategy. And so I first want to start off by going briefly over what I mean when I'm talking about deterrence. And so Donald Kagan is a wonderful expert on war, but also peace. And so Kagan explains that the goal of deterrence is to arouse such fear in an enemy as to make him decide against fighting. So in this sense, for deterrence to be a successful approach or US strategy, then other actors must first believe that attacking or fighting would be a futile endeavor. But let us also not forget that Kagan highlights the powers, that powers must be careful to not overestimate their own strength, and that it's okay to make concessions from a point of strength when necessary, because both of these components are strategies that fall under the deterrence category. And I might also add that peace does not exist on its own. It must be created and maintained. And so in my research, what I really came down with, or up with, I guess, are 3 recommendations. And so the first of these recommendations, when we're thinking about strengthening our US deterrent strategy, deals with funding, right? Increasing the investments in existing US space agencies. And I use that term broadly. I don't only mean that to encapsulate the primary source that we might think of, a place like NASA or Department of Defense, but also Department of Commerce, Department of Energy, some of these other US agencies that are also doing some amazing work in space, and also increasing public-private partnerships. The second recommendation that I have is to participate more in global dialogue, which emphasizes the need for and commitment to peace and space. And third, expand our joint spacekeeping effort. And I do also want to note that these approaches are nested. And so what that means is that to go to, for example, recommendation 3, that means that you need to carry out all the work that needs to be done in recommendation 2 and recommendation 1. And so I want to point that out. So getting into recommendation 1, we all, I'm assuming, understand the great work that can happen when there's public-private partnerships, right? One of the great things that governments, and particularly the US government, is great at is being a funder, right? And so the US government develops a lot of this super, super expensive technology that may be a little bit risky to private companies, but we also fund some great things that allow private companies to test how the technologies that we're using can be more cost effective. And so I have some examples of innovation through funding that I'm sure we all have heard about. And the benefit, again, of this is that, private companies are worried about the bottom line. They want to make sure that the things that they're producing are the most cost effective. And that will allow the US to actually scale up our enterprises, right? And this helps boost the notion that the US possesses an extreme and even insurmountable advantage in space, which of course will boost our deterrence. And so for recommendation 2, we need to participate more in global dialogue so that we can emphasize the need for and commitment to peace in space. And so what this may look like is expanding the audience and stakeholder engagement that we do to include other industries that may help move the needle on garnering enough support to shape and update and even create space engagement policies, right? And help shape the norms that we have in space. And so what this may look like is getting people in other industries, such as the economic industries, even people interested in climate change and sustainability, education, and health, to really see that their industries are indeed tied to ensuring that space remains peaceful, right? And also being able to sell that narrative to nations, to other nations and states, right? We all have a competitive advantage in something, and 9 times out of 10, that competitive advantage relies on some utility in the realm of space, right? And so how can we really change this conversation a little bit so that we're not just focusing on defense or security when we think about space, and we kind of broaden the platforms in which we're engaging in these conversations on. And the benefit of this will, again, allow us to shape the norms in policies, and then it'll help us when we're getting to recommendation 3, right? Which is expand our joint peacekeeping effort in space. And so, of course, as I just mentioned, all nations have interest in space, right? In making sure that space security is maintained and that it remains peaceful. And that also means that illiberal states have an interest. And so the US really should reframe how it thinks about partnership, because working with illiberal states to ensure peace in space is a necessary act, right? And there are going to be times where it may be mutually beneficial for the U.S. to partner with illiberal states, right? Whether that's in defense, whether that's in the areas of exploration or research, right? Because a lot of research and development is really expensive, and the US cannot afford, nor should we, take on the burden of funding every innovative project that there is out there. This also will help us create an allied front. If for some reason someone is an actor is thinking of maybe doing something malicious, deliberately malicious in space, in this platform that we all see as important, if we have this allied approach, they'll know that that attack is not going to be answered by just the US, but also the folks that are allied in our efforts to make sure that space is peaceful. A lot of people call this certain or different names, I guess. But for me, I like to think of it as the spoils approach, right? By partnering with illiberal nations, we take the chance potentially for other actors to do that. And so that might spoil any efforts that they have to be these space hegemons, right? And just some quick examples of what this might look like is that we could expand the Artemis Accords, or we could even develop a multinational NATO-like, but definitely not just Global North, but NATO-like treaty, as Lauren had also talked about in her presentation. And so I know some of you all may be thinking, hey, Angel, if we're going to talk about deterrence, we also have to talk about this major flaw, right, in our deterrence strategy, which is the attribution issue. And yes, I have also thought about the attribution issue. So have many other scholars, right? And so this is just a quick graphic that I thought provided a ton of information for this from the Centers for Strategic and International Studies. And this breaks down the 4 types of attack that Lauren went over in her presentation, and really the level of confidence that we could have in attributing those attacks. And so while attribution is a huge issue, and we definitely need to highlight and figure out solutions to this. I do believe that the recommendations that I listed and outlined do promote our ability to attribute attacks more effectively. For example, for recommendation 1, increasing private partnerships and funding to government agencies may allow us to create innovative technologies that'll that can better detect and also attribute these attacks. Changing the narrative around who should be interested in space, and even having the ability or being involved in these more global platforms may allow us to influence policy, right? And so that may allow us to steer the world really in a place where maybe disarmament is actually on the agenda, and maybe we do have some policies around that. And then lastly, recommendation 3, creating partnerships with unlikely nations, that may actually help to squash the need for opponents to behave badly, or to even think that behaving badly is an option in space, right? If we're partnering with folks and folks are benefiting, again, thinking of Kagan, concession is not bad when you're conceding from a point of strength. So, it's not bad. The US doesn't have to take up 100% of all that there is to do in space, right? We could take up 99 and share the other 1%, right? I don't think that's a losing strategy. And so with that, I yield because I know Lauren and I are looking forward to having conversations and fielding questions. So yeah, I'll open the floor up.
Thank you both so much. We have one question already. Are either of you aware of recent space law changes regarding weapons in space or tools designed to attack other spacecraft? Either of you can take it.
Okay, I can go first. The institute that Angel mentioned previously, I'm sorry, the name escapes me.
Center for Strategic and International Studies.
Yes, they actually put out a really excellent overview every year of different advances in space weapons capabilities, technologies that happen across several countries, primarily those that pose the greatest threat to the United States, which would be Russia, China, they go over Iran. So there are a lot of really interesting developments that have been happening recently. If whoever asked the question, I'm sorry, I didn't catch the name, has any particular developments they'd like to talk about.
And I would add that as far as I know, there hasn't been any laws, right, codified laws on restricting weapons in space, right? Actually, the same study that Lauren and I are talking about, right, alludes to the fact that, Russia is testing some high power strength, laser, I guess, for lack of a better word. This year, actually, that is slated to happen. We know that there's the joint MOU that was signed by China and Russia to conduct, space exploration together and launch, a joint space station, right? Or for China to launch part of their space station, I should say. And so I don't think that there are laws that I know of. And if anyone in the audience knows, please feel free to chat and chime in. But I don't know of any laws that are codified that are looking to deter or curb the amount of space weapons, especially that are like agreed upon by the major powers.
All right, thank you. I don't see any other questions, so I'm just going to urge the attendees, if you have questions, please type them in the chat or use the QA function in Zoom. I'm going to give it a few seconds in case anyone's typing anything. I do want to say your slides looked great, so.
Thank you. Thank you, Canva.
And also, if there's any like pushback or like, I don't know, let's open this up to like a conversation.
Ooh, how do we define weapons of mass destruction in space?
The weapons of mass destruction specifically referenced in the Outer Space Treaty, I believe have been pretty universally interpreted to mean nuclear weapons. I think it kind of depends on, the extent of destructive capability, but that is how it's kind of far and wide been interpreted.
And I think that's partly because when we're looking at the Outer Space Treaty, like, right, in 67, and even some of these other engagements that were happening in like the 80s, we were still in the midst of like this Cold War, right? And so it was definitely, everyone was afraid of nuclear weapons, right? And I think that that was the big issue, is that we don't want to have nuclear weapons in space. And now, unfortunately, our policies haven't really evolved, I guess, to think about the weapons that we have available to us today, because as Lauren went over, it's not just weapons of mass destruction, right? There are all sorts of weapons that exist.
I think that leads to the follow-up from that question, which is, do you think that that definition should change?
I mean, I think personally that our interpretation of that law should change. I think a lot of the international community, they interpret that a lot more kind of broadly than we do, that international or the Outer Space Treaty, to mean, limitation on weaponization in general, and kind of to go along with the spirit of that. Whereas we have kind of interpreted it very narrowly in order to maintain our ability to develop our counter space weaponry and our capabilities. Angel, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a difficult question because as Lauren outlined in her presentation, there's a real advantage, right, of having some of these technologies or weapons in space, right? And so I think that if it is left unchecked, that could lead to problems, right? But I also think that there may be issues with strengthening or redefining what weapons actually are in space, because so many of the satellites that we use are used for other things, right? As Lauren also highlighted. So I think that it's tricky. I'm not even sure if changing what we classify as weapons will get us all the way there, because I think as Lauren and I both kind of pointed out, that this partnership and this international kind of joint collaborative approach to space exploration and keeping space secure, and really just keeping peace in space, I think is probably going to be the most effective. Because I just think about the feasibility of redefining what a space weapon is.
Yeah, and I like that question. I appreciate that question, because I think that's the whole root of it, is like I kind of talked about in my presentation, is how do we define a space weapon? Within, I believe, like the past year, China deployed a new technology on one of their satellites that is an arm that is kind of mobile, that can grab. And the reason that they put forward for this was to help clear space debris, which is great. But what a lot of experts, technological experts, say is that that kind of tool wouldn't be effective for removing space debris, but it would be effective for potentially damaging passing satellites. So this is another piece of technology, not nominally a weapon, but can definitely, and was most likely made with the intention to cause damage to equipment in space. So it's a tough question. It's a tough conversation, but I think it's the question and the conversation if we're ever going to get to, really effective international regulations on anti-weaponization. Yes, me too.
I don't see any other questions in the queue
Thank you.
yet. I'll just wait a few seconds and see if any other questions come in. I don't see any other questions. So unless a one pops up just now, I think that's it. Unless you have closing comments from either of you that you'd like to share with us. Thank you so much. It was a wonderful, wonderful talk by both of you.
Thank you all. And I will drop the link to the, I guess, study that was published that Lauren and I both referenced, just in case anyone is interested in.
Yeah, this organization is an excellent resource in general on, space security related issues.
I see a raised hand. If you would like to just type your question in the Q&A section or in the chat. I do not see it in the Q&A. So if you want to just type it directly in the chat, then we can field it. I still don't see the question in the Q&A. I'm not sure if you're typing it in the chat for us. It has not come up in the Q&A section for me. Sorry about that. All right. Private companies are launching their own satellite constellations. Do you see these private entities being governed by other countries?
Angela, I know you touched on the private aspect a little bit.
Yeah. So one of the things that I didn't touch on in this presentation, but definitely came up while researching was this exact fact, right? Like there's this heightened amount of private companies who are now engaging in space activities. And it's really tricky because technically the countries that allow these private companies into space are also responsible for them while they're in space, or at least that's how the law can be interpreted. And so I do think that because of that, there may be more wiggle room for governments to control what these companies are doing in space. I don't necessarily think that that's an issue or would be an issue for, like, for example, the Starlink constellation and like the US government. But I do think in some of the other nations, such as the first one that comes to mind for me is China, who has a huge amount of private companies, right, who are all interested in going to space and in space endeavors. There might be the ability there for, the Chinese government to maybe take control of some of these companies, or really define what it is that they can do, or take or seize some of this technology, right? Like that wouldn't be surprising to me. But I don't know. I think that it can happen. I wouldn't be surprised if it was already happening. And I think that that means that as far as it goes for like the US or for any other nation, right, you would just have to be hyper vigilant and kind of have a level of scrutiny to the private companies that you are actually engaging with. I don't think that there's many restrictions because I do know that SpaceX is like working with the UAE right now for some of their like satellite capabilities. So I don't think, and even the award that I mentioned in one of my slides that went out for that NASA put out for like collection of moon rocks. I think one of the companies they paid like $1, right? But the company just really wanted to be involved. Like two of those agencies or companies are US based and the other two aren't, right? And so I think that there's a way that we can collaborate across countries, but I do think that there is the potential that some companies, depending on the type of, I guess, governance that rules their country, you might have to have higher scrutiny for because you just never know.
We have a question for Lauren. We see that China and Russia are closing the gap when it comes to space endeavors. How do you think the US will play a role in the diplomacy in 10 years?
Yeah, I mean, hopefully a more kind of active role in diplomacy in that area. You know, when it comes to these non-weaponization, non-proliferation, international discussions, the US has been kind of largely absent. I mentioned even back in the time of the Soviet Union, they were suggesting many resolutions, different international organizations that would do things like oversee the rocket supply chains, and that would do different kind of oversight functions. And even since then, you know, Russia and China have really been the ones leading this kind of international diplomatic cooperative effort. And so hopefully, I think in the next 10 years, we might see the United States take a more active role in that conversation. They haven't in the past taken as active of a role. They have mainly played the obstructionist, but here's to hoping.
We have another question. I believe this is directed to Angel. So with what you were talking about in mind with private companies, does this mean that there are no NATO conditions that affect commercial companies moving to other countries?
So for clarification, are we talking about like if a US based company wanted to move their headquarters or their operations to say Russia, is there a NATO? Are we asking if that's like if there's a NATO regulation regarding that or just partnering?
We'll see if a clarification comes in through the chat. In the meantime, private enterprise capability as contractors to US military or independent business gets ahead of technology supremacy. A supremacy race is inevitable. Will the US increase contractor status or qualify new research as military?
That's a really interesting question. I haven't seen much discussion over this, you know, exact topic, but personally, with I see kind of maybe with the startup of the Space Force that there might be an increased military role for the United States and kind of incorporating these different technology ventures. However, at the same time, and I think we've seen a more powerful kind of surge of private business in this sector. So I don't really see the US really kind of taking over, co-opting that private business side of things into the military. It's definitely possible, and thank you for bringing up that question. I'm gonna start looking into that.
And I will say, so I agree with Lauren. I don't think that just like randomly, right? Like the government would come and be like, hey, we see that you're really doing great in this arena. It's ours now. But I do foresee there being which already happens now, right? Where the US funds something, like the government funds something, and that intellectual property, once that company figures out how to maybe bring down the cost for whatever type of panel or to use less fuel to do X, Y, and Z, if that is kind of discovered with the government funds, then that technology or that like technological advancement does become property in a lot of cases of the US government, but that is like in the contract, right? Like, so the contractors know. And so I that is already happening, but I don't think, I don't want to say no because you never know, and space is a crazy place. But I don't see for the US seizing information from a private business or a contractor. Maybe, actually, I'll backtrack on that. It might be a thing. I should look into it more. I know that it does happen though already in a lot of government funded programs. That does happen. And I think if it was an advancement that was like crucial, right? The US was like, this is crucial to our like security, then I could see it becoming something where, you know, the research will become part of our national defense, right? And then somehow that can get co-opted. So that's a great question. All these questions are great. I'm like, I'm going to write that down. Thank you.
All right. I haven't seen a clarification on that NATO question come through. So maybe if you want to just address the two possible ways you read that question. Do you want me to repeat the NATO question?
No, thank you. I see it.
Okay.
So let's see.
Oh, actually, the person who asked the question is asking if you can repeat what your question back to them was.
Oh, yeah. So my clarifying question was, do you mean, is there NATO conditions that says like a company can't pack up like their headquarters and move from like the US to another nation? Or is this just in terms of partnership altogether? Like it is, and I think it's reading like just completely packing up and moving to another country, but I just wanted to clarify.
Let's see if the clarification comes in on that. You both mentioned space debris. Based on your research, has the US been the only one to consider it? Do other countries consider the potential destruction that could happen with a collision event?
It's definitely something that other countries are very aware of. Like I mentioned, China, at least under the auspice of addressing this space debris issue, has tried to create technological solutions. But I think these countries are pragmatic. So they, of course, study this, they look at ways to address it because it poses a critical threat to their interests. So I do think that's one thing that unifies all of these different stakeholders. Primary interest is the damage that this could cause. Not that that has necessarily stopped many countries from performing these kind of tests, but
All right, we have a clarification on the NATO question. Perhaps if it takes on a potential threat, maybe it wouldn't matter if it is partnership or packing up and moving altogether. Would this be something NATO has continued the movement of commercial companies doing that?
So I was actually just responding. I was going to type in do a response. So I'm happy that we're circling back because it saved me a lot of texting, I guess, or typing. And so I do not know of any NATO conditions that says that like a commercial company or a private company can't be headquartered in another nation, right? Or can't partner with another nation, because we do see that that's already happening, at least for partnership, right? I do know that, like with most other things, right? Like you would not be able to divulge those secrets because, again, that information becomes, especially in the case of the US, and I'm sure it would be for other nations, like that becomes property of the government, and that becomes a matter of national security, right? And so I don't think that there's a ban that a person couldn't, that would prohibit a person or a company from moving their headquarters or from partnering with another nation. I do not, but that does not mean that there wouldn't be, in my mind, repercussions, right? And so if you have helped us develop, and by us, I mean the United States government, develop technologies that are going to drastically improve our like attribution rates, right? Like that is my information. That's how I would look at that. Like that is my intellectual property, and you cannot then go share that with, say, Russia, right? Even if you move your headquarters to Russia, like you would have to keep that under wraps because now that is the U.S. intellectual property. And I could also see there being other repercussions too, right? Which is like maybe you could never get another US government contract. If you did set up shop and go to a country that we were kind of at odds with, or if you were partnering with companies that we say, hey, that might be a security risk, like, right, we might have to be a little bit more stringent on that. But I do not think that there's a NATO condition or a law that says that a private company can't move their headquarters or partner with other nations. So thank you. That was an interesting question as well.
I don't see any other questions at the moment. All right. Well, in that case, I think we will close it up. And thank you so much. This was wonderful. And I hope everyone, I think this is the last session for today. So I hope everyone has a great rest and is ready for more conference tomorrow.
Thank you all. It was a pleasure. And thanks for sticking with us till the end of the day. So I appreciate you all. Have a good rest of your week.
Yes, thank you all for the great discussion, great questions. I look forward to hopefully seeing y'all in some panels tomorrow.
All right. Bye, everyone.